Congresswoman Ilhan Omar had been in Washington long enough to know the difference between a witness and a threat. She had looked across committee tables at cabinet members, generals, and chief executives. She had taken every one of them apart with the precision of someone who treats a hearing the way a surgeon treats an operating room. Controlled entry, controlled tempo, and a clean exit before anyone realizes what just happened. She looked at J.D. Vance sitting alone at the witness table with his one notebook, and she made a calculation. She saw what he wanted her to see. A man from Appalachia who had gotten famous writing about other people's pain, and then climbed into the orbit of the most polarizing figure in modern American politics. She had lines prepared. She had been preparing them for days. They were good lines, sharp and memorable, the kind that shear off clean into 30-second clips. She was going to deploy them early, define the frame before he could, and walk out of that room having controlled every inch of the narrative. She executed the plan exactly. It did not go the way the plan said it would. The hearing itself was unremarkable for its first 11 minutes. Foreign aid appropriations markup, the kind of procedural session that fills the back half of a C-SPAN broadcast and empties the gallery by midday. Members trickled in holding coffee. Staffers lined the back wall and checked their phones with the particular indifference of people who have attended 300 of these and expect a 301st. The chairman opened. The witness was introduced. The camera operators adjusted their angles without urgency. Vance sat at the witness table with the notebook closed in front of him. He did not arrange anything. He did not review materials. He sat with the stillness of a man who had already finished all of his reviewing. Then Congresswoman Omar was recognized for her time. She did not begin with a question. She turned in her chair toward the witness table the way a prosecutor turns toward a defendant she has already decided about. And she announced to the room that before the committee continued, the American people deserved a frank accounting of who they were dealing with. She said Vance had built his public profile in the service of a man who had attempted to dismantle the republic from the inside. She said he represented not the working communities he had written about, but a single billionaire and a single ego operating in permanent coordination. And then she smiled, the small, calibrated smile of a woman who has thrown this kind of punch before and watched it connect. And she delivered the line she had been saving for last. He was, she said with the greatest respect, a puppet who had learned to quote scripture. Behind her, a junior member nodded. A staffer near the exit actually grinned. It was a good line. She knew it was a good line. She folded her hands and settled back to wait for the bluster. The bluster did not come. Vance sat completely still for 3 full seconds. He uncapped the pen. He made a single small mark in the notebook. And then he looked up with the unhurried expression of a man who has just heard something that mildly interested him and asked if she was finished. He said he would hate to interrupt a closing argument. The smile left her face in the time it takes a match to go out. He told the room he thought her instinct was exactly right. Honesty was a fine starting point. He was fully in favor of it. So let us, he said, be honest about both of us. Let us put everything on the table, the way you asked. Something in the temperature of the room shifted, and the people who noticed it could not have said exactly when it happened. But it happened. The staffer near the exit stopped grinning. A senior member 2 seats down from Omar looked up from his notepad for the first time in 10 minutes. Vance said he wanted to begin with something she had said. Not today, he clarified. Today, she had been careful. He meant something she had said before, in public, in front of cameras, more than once and without reservation. In those statements, she had placed the United States of America in the same sentence, the same moral category as extremist organizations. She had used the phrase unthinkable tragedies and applied it equally to American foreign policy and to the kind of men who blow up marketplaces and shoot school children for the crime of attending class. Omar leaned into her microphone immediately. She told him he was distorting deliberately. She had the full quote. She could read every word of it into the record right now. If he preferred, the context was about holding all governments accountable. A real leader, she said, as opposed to a talk show patriot, would understand the difference. He continued without acknowledging that she had spoken, not rudely, not dismissively, with the particular calm of a man who intends to finish one thought before beginning the next, and that calm was somehow more unnerving than interruption would have been. He said this country had taken her family out of a refugee camp. It had fed her. It had educated her. It had given her a language, a travel document, the right to vote, and then And this was the part he said he kept returning to. It had given her one of exactly 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives. He said there were farmers in Ohio whose great-grandfathers were buried in the soil of that state. Men who paid their taxes without complaint and sent their sons overseas and came home to find their industries gone and their towns hollowed, and who would never come within 100 miles of the chair she was sitting in. America had not simply opened a door for her. It had walked her through the building and handed her the microphone at the front of the room. And the first thing she had chosen to say into that microphone, he said, was that the people who handed it to her belonged on the same shelf as the people who blow up civilians in city squares. The reporter in the front row had stopped typing. He was just watching. She came back hard, and she was right too, because she still had ground to fight on, and she knew how to fight. She told him what he was doing had a name. He was telling an immigrant woman to remember her place. He was converting her refugee history into a ceiling, a permanent limitation on the criticism she was permitted to voice. He was informing her, in the polite language of a Senate hearing, that gratitude was the tax this country levied on women who looked like her, and that the tax had no expiration date. She turned toward the cameras the way she always did when the room was beginning to move with her. She said they could not argue with what she had actually said, so they went looking instead for the camp she was born in. They waved her history in her face like a receipt. She was not a guest. She had been elected by Americans. No flag pin conferred the authority to dictate which truths a refugee was authorized to speak out loud. A member behind her said quietly, "That's right." The room had shifted, and she knew it, and for a moment the momentum was genuinely hers. Vance let it peak. He waited until it had fully crested and begun its natural descent. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man giving a point its due, and leaned forward. He said he was a United States Marine. He said he would defend her right to criticize this country with his life, because he had stood in places where that right did not exist, and he had seen the price people paid for its absence. Criticism, he said, was not un-American. Criticism was the engine of the whole project. He had done plenty of it himself, loudly on the record. He opened the notebook again, unhurried. He said criticism sounded like this: "Our foreign policy is broken. That conflict was a mistake, and good men died for nothing." He said he would stand beside her and shout both of those things until he lost his voice. But that, he said, was not what she had done. She had not criticized the country that saved her family. She had ranked it. She had placed the nation that pulled her people out of the dust on the same moral shelf as the forces other families needed saving from. There was a measurable distance between criticizing your home and despising it. And they were going to spend the next few minutes, he said, measuring exactly how far she had traveled across that distance. He turned a page. 1995, a refugee camp in Kenya, a girl of 8 years old, a country on the opposite side of the earth that had never met her family and had no obligation to them agreeing to take them in anyway, not because they had earned admission, but because that was what this country did when it was operating at its best. 1997, citizenship. 2016, a state legislature. 2018, the floor of the United States Congress. He said that was not his story about her. That was her story. She had told it beautifully and often, and she should, because it was a story that could only have happened in one country on earth, which was exactly, he said, why it stopped a breath in his chest to hear her compare that country to the men who would have harmed that 8-year-old girl in the street. She of all people understood what those men were. She had come from a world defined by what they were willing to do. America was the thing that had stood between her and them, and she had put them on the same shelf. Omar reached for the water glass. Her hand for now was steady. She drank, set the glass down, and squared the papers in front of her with the precise, deliberate motion of a woman rebuilding her composure from the outside in. "Now," he said, "let us talk about money." She had raised it herself. She had said he represented one billionaire and one ego, so let them follow the money. Hers and his in public. On the record, he thought that was fair. He drew a folder from beneath the notebook. He did not open it for the cameras, the way a man opens something he wants the cameras to see. He opened it the flat, quiet way a doctor opens a chart he has already memorized. February of 2019, a tweet. 3 words that had followed her since the moment she sent them. She had described congressional support for an American ally as being, in her phrasing, all about the Benjamins, baby. $100 bill. Her theory of how Washington functioned, distilled into a single line. Underneath every stated principle in this building, someone somewhere was quietly getting paid. He said something she might not expect. He agreed with her. Money corrupted. It corrupted constantly and quietly and in both directions across the aisle. The distance between them was not whether money influenced power, but a simpler question. Whose money and whose household? He turned the page. Federal Election Commission filings. Public record available to anyone in the room on a phone in under 30 seconds. Over the course of her campaigns, her operation had paid a political consulting firm called the East Street Group approximately $2.8 million. The firm was run by a man named Tim Minett. During the period when that money was flowing into his company, Minett had separated from his wife and subsequently married her. The low murmur that moved through the room started at the back wall and rolled forward. Omar said immediately that the FEC had reviewed the arrangement and cleared it, unanimously, 6-0. It was a settled matter, investigated and dismissed years before, and he was dragging it back into the room because he had nothing of substance to offer. He said he had read the ruling, he was not disputing it, he was not sitting here accusing her of a crime, and he wanted that on the record without ambiguity. The FEC had cleared it 6-0, but she had not run for Congress, promising her constituents that she would be legal. Legal was the floor of the building, not the standard she had campaigned on. She had run telling the people of Minnesota that this entire city was a swamp of insiders who routed money toward the people they loved and then dressed the arrangement in the language of principle. $2.8 million. Other people's money passing through the company of the man she married, and then after she had publicly announced she was severing the relationship, another $138,000 paid afterward. Every dollar documented, every dollar for legitimate campaign work. He set the page down. He said her own words back to her across the table as quietly as handing someone a receipt. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. She had written that about other people's motives, he said, about their hidden loyalties and their concealed transactions. She had made the suspicion of other people's money the foundation of her public identity, while $2.8 million of those same dollars moved out of her donors' accounts and into her own household. He asked, simply and directly, whether she applied the same theory to herself that she applied to everyone else, or whether the theory stopped at her front door. The counterattack she launched was real, and she meant every word of it. She told him he had written a book about the suffering of poor white communities in Appalachia, sold that suffering to publishing houses, collected the advance, and then gone to work for the venture capital firms in San Francisco that had shipped those same communities jobs overseas. He had monetized the tragedy he had climbed out of and never once looked back at. He did not get to sit across from her playing the role of the plain-spoken honest man. It landed. Several members turned to watch his reaction. A staffer audibly said, "Oh," and she pressed it, leaning forward, finger tapping the table, pointing out that the entire city ran on the very arrangement he was describing. Consultants and posters and brothers-in-law on the payroll and spouses with the lobbying contracts. He had walked into this room with a folder targeting the immigrant woman. He wanted the people watching to believe this was about ethics and not about something considerably older and uglier than ethics. She turned to the cameras. The firm had done legitimate documented work and been paid for it. The watchdog agency that existed to review exactly this had cleared it unanimously. That was the beginning and the middle and the end of the story, unless he needed it to be something else. And he needed it to be something else, didn't he? Because something else was the only thing he had brought into the room with him. For several seconds, the momentum was entirely hers. Vance gave a small nod, the nod of a man acknowledging a punch that made contact. He said she was right about the book. People had bought it. It had changed his life. He would not pretend otherwise. She could think whatever she wanted about the man he became, but here was the only distinction that mattered in this room. He had never constructed his entire public identity around the proposition that money was the secret hidden corruption of everyone in Washington except him. She had made the accusation of financial motive her whole brand, the lens through which she invited the public to evaluate every person in the building. And $2.8 million said she could not survive having that standard applied to herself. A thin line of water had crept from the base of the glass across the corner of her papers. She had not noticed it yet. Every camera in the room had. Then he put the folder away. He folded his hands on top of it and went quiet. And the quiet was heavier than anything he had said in the previous hour. He told her he wanted to read her 8 words, not his words, hers from a speech she had delivered to a public audience. She started to speak, some people. He said did something. The room did not gasp. It did something stranger. It stopped producing sound of any kind. The particular silence of a space that has just received a thing it cannot immediately process. He said her name had been attached to a microphone on a public stage, and she had described the attacks of September 11th, 2001, the single largest act of mass murder ever committed on American soil, as some people doing something, some people, something. He let the silence extend until it was physically uncomfortable. 2,977 people had not returned home from ordinary mornings. He said they were not some people. They had names that their children still spoke out loud at kitchen tables. There was a man named Nicholas Harros Jr., whose mother Frances had been lost in the towers. On the anniversary, he had stood at Ground Zero wearing a shirt printed with her exact words and read the names of the dead into a microphone in front of the surviving families, because she had turned the worst morning of those families' lives into a rhetorical shrug, into a subordinate clause in a speech about something else. Omar's voice cracked at his edge when she responded. She heard it crack, and the hearing of it seemed to unsettle her more than anything he had said. She said the quote had been stripped of context deliberately by people like him. She invited him to provide the context then. He said he would wait. He said, tell this room what sentence comes after. Some people did something that makes 3,000 funerals sit comfortably in anyone's mouth. Take all the time you need. She began twice and stopped both times. And then for the first time since the hearing began, his voice changed. It did not get louder. It got colder and harder, and he set down the formal address he had been using all afternoon. He told her he had sat in living rooms with Gold Star mothers. He had folded the flag and carried it to widows who could not stop shaking. So he was going to say one thing plainly and then move on. 3,000 dead Americans were not some people. Being trapped at a desk while a building collapsed around you, or making the decision to step from a window because the fire behind you was worse, was not something. She was among the most gifted public communicators in the entire Congress. Her allies knew it. Her opponents knew it. He knew it. On the morning she delivered that speech, she had access to every word in the English language, and she had reached for the people who fell, for the 2 emptiest words available. That was not a stumble. A stumble was a wrong date or a mispronounced name. That was a choice that originated somewhere inside her. And the entire country had been given a clear view of exactly what she had chosen. A woman in the gallery pressed both hands over her mouth. Somewhere behind her, a chair scraped once and went still. And then cornered, she played the last card she had. She said everything he had done in that room had been done because she was a Black woman and a Muslim and a refugee who had refused to remain grateful and silent on cue. She said men in his position could not tolerate the sight of someone who looked like her holding a seat like this one. She said this was not a hearing. It was prejudice dressed in good tailoring. It was the move the room had been waiting for, and it was the move Vance had been waiting for longer. He did not answer her. He turned his eyes 2 seats down the witness table to a man who had sat in complete silence through the entire proceeding. Dark suit, small lapel pin, the cross flags of the United States and the United States Marine Corps catching the light. The placard in front of him read Major. Retired Samir Haddad. Major Haddad leaned into his microphone. He said he had been born in Beirut. He was a Muslim. He had prayed that morning before he came to the building. He had come to this country as a young man with nothing in his pockets, the same as her family. He had worn the uniform of the United States Marine Corps for 22 years. He had carried friends off of mountains in pieces. He had buried some of them under the flag with his own hands. He said no one at this table had said one word about her faith, her ancestry, or the camp she had been born in. The vice president had read her campaign's bank records, which were public. He had read a speech she had delivered, which was public. That was the sum total of what had occurred here. And when she found that she could not answer for the money or for the speech, she had reached for him. She had reached for the color of his skin in the name of his God and attempted to hold them up in front of her face like a barrier. He said he had not survived what he survived so that she could hide behind men like him. When the questions became difficult, "Put the shield down," he said, and answer him. The room broke, not into applause, into a release of collective breath, a sound that rolled from wall to wall like a wave that had been held back too long. And then, while that sound was still in the air, something quieter happened that hit harder than anything said aloud. 3 seats down from Omar, a senior Democratic congressman who had gone on cable TV and defended her by name more than once, who had publicly called her critics motivated by prejudice, quietly closed his binder. He capped his pen, he stood up, and walked out the side door of the hearing room. He did not make a statement. He did not address the cameras. He simply left, and the soft mechanical click of that door settling into its frame was, in the particular silence that had overtaken the room, the loudest sound of the afternoon. Every person present understood exactly what it meant. Omar watched him go. She watched her last visible ally step out of the frame, and something behind her eyes gave way. She reached for the water glass. Her hand was trembling now, not slightly, and as she lifted it, the water spilled across the papers in front of her. Across the top page, the one bearing her name in printed bold letters, the ink ran outward in a spreading gray smear. She set the glass down. It knocked against the wood once, twice stilled, the cameras held on her hands. Vance said he would make it simple. There was no victory in his voice. If anything, he sounded like a man who had been required to say a necessary thing and found no pleasure in the necessity. He said he would rather quote scripture he actually believed than spend $2.8 million he had spent years shaming other people for spending. He would rather be loyal to a country that had lifted his neighbors out of poverty than be fluent in every argument for why that country was irredeemably corrupt. And he said he would rather lose every election he ever ran in, go home to Ohio, and never hold another office than stand at a podium one time and call 3,000 lost Americans something. He leaned toward the microphone for the final line. The room was so completely still that the cameras picked up the faint electrical hum of the overhead lights. "America gave you the microphone," he said. "One beat, hand it back." The gavel did not come down for a long moment. Nobody in the room moved at all. Omar sat behind her water-stained papers, mouth slightly parted, no words available behind it, and her eyes were not on Vance. They were fixed on the back wall, on the bank of cameras, every red recording light burning, every lens still feeding the moment out live to the millions of people who would clip these seconds and replay them through the end of the week and far beyond, and written plainly on her face, visible to every one of those cameras, was the single thought she could not suppress. She wished they were off in the gallery. The man in the veteran's cap rose slowly to his feet. He did not clap. He did not call out. He simply stood the way men of a certain age stand when something they had given up on has briefly reappeared in the room in front of them. After a moment, a woman 2 rows over stood with him, then a young man near the far door, until a quiet column of people filled the gallery, standing in a silence heavier than any ovation, in the particular stillness of people who have just witnessed something they already know they will carry. Vance was the last to leave. He gathered the leather notebook from the table. One notebook, the only thing he had brought in. He glanced once at the empty chair, at the glass still sitting in the small lake it had made, at the gray smear where her name had been printed and was now only a suggestion of itself drying slowly under the lights. He did not smile. For a moment, he looked like a man who had been right about another human being and found in no comfort at all. Then he tucked the notebook under his arm and walked out into the afternoon where the cameras were waiting, where the clip was already past 1 million views, where the country was already arguing about 8 words and about which of 2 people had, finally and on the record and in front of everyone, answered them.